Welcome everybody to today's evening talk with Stephen Batchelor. The Buddhist Academy invited him. I think many of you know Stephen, maybe from his writings. The Buddhist Academy tries to represent different Buddhist traditions. So our program represents Theravada Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and also, of course, a secular approach to Buddhism. And I think Stephen is maybe one of the most well-known Buddhists with a secular approach to the Buddhist teachings. And more than 20 years ago, he published a book with the title Buddhismus für Ungläubige in German. And his latest book was last year, The Art of Solitude. And it's already translated into German, Die Kunst, mit sich alleine zu sein. It was published in Steinrich Verlag. Now I would like to hand over to Stephen and wish us all an inspiring evening.
Thank you very much, Janina, and thank you to everyone at the Buddhistische Akademie who have organized this evening. And welcome to all of you who have decided to spend your evening listening to what I have to say, and we'll have plenty of time for questions, discussion. We're also going to do some meditation. So hopefully it's a time we can use to just reconnect with ourselves, reconnect with things that really matter for us in our lives. Just to let you know where I am, in the world of COVID-19, meeting on Zoom, we inhabit a virtual cyberspace for our meetings, which is very impersonal and somehow, dislocated. I'm speaking to you from my home in southwest France, just outside the city of Bordeaux. I'm in a little village, and I've been here pretty much for the last year. My usual life of going to the airport and getting on a plane and going to Berlin or to London or to New York, that's all finished. And everything that I do now is done in this medium. And perhaps we could spend a few moments also just remembering where we are in our physical location, that we're not floating above the world in some computerized space, but we're also in our own bodies, in our own homes, or wherever we are, in a physical location that is the basis for our lives at this moment. Janina mentioned that I'm a proponent of a secular approach to Buddhism, sometimes called secular Buddhism, secular Dharma. And yet this evening, I'm going to be talking about faith and imagination in Dharma practice. And I hope to share with you how faith and secularism go together perfectly okay. And that's going to be our theme. So, faith and imagination. These are two central virtues that I feel need to be cultivated in Dharma practice. Often, faith and imagination are thought of as somehow opposite. Faith, you believe what is true because of your faith in a religion or in a political philosophy. And there's not much room for change. That's the way it is. This is what the Bible says. This is what the Pali Canon says. And you've got faith in that, poof, that's it. Imagination, on the other hand, suggests that you are free to imagine creatively other ways of thinking, other ways of behaving. It's very much associated with the arts. with literature, with painting, with architecture, with dance. Be imaginative. Don't just accept what people say. Think for yourself. Imagine what would be a better world that we might all live in. Imagine the sort of person that you could become. Imagine what kind of life you might lead. So these two principles, in some ways, exist in tension with each other, faith and imagination. Both of them, however, are found among the central virtues of the Dharma, of Buddhism, but neither are particularly, are given particular importance or centrality in many books and teachings we read. In fact, imagination particularly, we don't find in Buddhist teachings much that is said about the imagination, the importance of the imagination. And particularly if our approach to Buddhism is more secular, if it's more to do with personal transformation, if it's more like a kind of therapeutic approach, we'll also won't hear a great deal about faith. So I think both of these ideas in some ways are found on the edges of Buddhism as it is presented today in modernity. Let's start by just giving a very brief suggestion as to how we might understand the two and how they are connected. For me, faith provides the courage and the motivation to address the challenges of life fearlessly, with conviction, while imagination liberates us from fixed opinions and views and allows new possibilities to present themselves as responses to those challenges. So the two go together. The courage and motivation to address our lives with all their difficulties and their stresses and their suffering. And imagination is the creative response, the creative engagement that allows us to find new ways, maybe more skillful ways of addressing those very challenges. Although we're not, most of us, native English speakers, if we know English well enough, we know how to use both of these words. We know what faith means, we know what imagination means. But if we were asked to give a definition of faith or a definition of imagination, we might find that very difficult. I'm not interested in giving you definitions on this course, on this lecture. But I'm going to explore different ways in which these ideas are used and how they might be helpful. You see, I think we already know what they mean. We know, for example, in a relationship, what it means to be faithful to your partner. We know what it means to have faith in democracy. We know what it means to be a person of faith, ein Gläubiger rather than an Ungläubiger. But this doesn't mean that we have a way of saying what connects all those different uses together. That's another story. So we just, I think, have to trust our own intuitive sense, our own usage of these words in everyday speech. I'm reminded of a passage from Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is in his Philosophische Untersuchungen, his philosophical investigations. And one of them says, how do I know this is red, rot? And in the English translation of the German, it says, one answer would be, because I have learned English. How do I know this is red? Because I speak English. In other words, if you are part of that language community, you already know what these things mean. Of course, you can take your understanding further, but at a very basic level, you know how to use these words in the language you speak. Before I go into faith and imagination, let's just step back and consider what we mean by the practice of Dharma practice. That faith and imagination are both necessary in the practice of the Dharma. They're included. And the way that I understand the practice of the Dharma, and some of you will have heard me say this before, it's very much the theme of many of my recent books, is that the practice of the Dharma is the practice of 4 interconnected tasks, Aufgabe. And these tasks are to embrace life, to let go of reactivity, to behold the stopping of reactivity, and to cultivate the Eightfold Path. And this has been for me the framework, not only for my own practice personally, but also in the way that I'm trying to develop a more secular approach to the Dharma. By presenting the Dharma as a set of tasks, we're not being asked to believe anything. We're not being asked to believe that ignorance or craving are the cause of suffering. We're not being asked to believe that the Eightfold Path will lead us to nirvana. These are Buddhist beliefs. And in most forms of traditional Buddhism, these are the basis of our faith in the Dharma. I'm going to understand faith rather differently, as we will see. But the framework, the Zusammenhang of this practice is one that is primarily engaging in certain tasks rather than holding certain beliefs. To embrace life, in other words, when whatever situation we find ourselves in, particularly situations that are challenging and difficult, to be able initially to be able to say yes to that situation, to be able to hold it, to embrace it. Even though that's very painful, even though it goes against our instincts, to be able to reach out to the other person, to embrace the situation. And that's the foundation of this engagement with life. It doesn't mean that we then say, well, that's okay, there's nothing I can do about it. This is the basis for developing another way of responding to life rather than simply following our habits, our preferences, our conditioning, and behaving in a reactive way. Might be comes more naturally, but here, as we did in this meditation, we're just stopping and we're saying, yes, this is how I am right now. This is the life that I'm encountering right now. And that's the first task, to be able to say yes. And at the same time, to be able to say yes to how I'm reacting. I might be reacting with aversion or hatred. I might be reacting with fear. I might be reacting with clinging or craving or grasping. I might be reacting by just holding on to a very fixed opinion. I'm right, I know about this, and this is wrong. And getting stuck in that thought, in that picture of your mind. So the second task is to not get caught up in that reactivity. To see it, to accept it, to say yes to it, but then to leave it alone. To let it play itself out, to let it become part of your consciousness, but not to be hooked and then driven by that force, that power. And again, that sometimes is very difficult. We are creatures of habit and conditioning, whether we like it or not. And there are many of our ways of reacting to the world are driven precisely by what's so familiar, what feels so right. But can we just remain with that, not suppressing it or denying it, but being able to be with it and yet not dictated or driven by it. And this allows us to engage with the third task, is to notice that when we are mindful, when we're aware, as I pointed out in the meditation, we can notice that there's a non-reactive awareness within us that is not caught up in fear, in hatred, in opinions, in cravings, but is able to step back and see those things for what they are, as the play of the mind, as the result of conditions. And that opens up a contemplative space, a space of solitude, a space of freedom. And to me, that's the core of meditation practice, is to come to rest in that non-reactive awareness. And that is essentially the meaning of nirvana, nibbana. Nibbana, as the Buddha described it, is the end of attachment, the end of greed, the end of hatred, the end of confusion. So in the absence of reactivity, we open our minds and our hearts and our bodies to this dwelling, this wohnen in this non-reactive perspective. And that perspective opens up the possibility of responding to the situation we find ourselves in life, rather than just reacting to it. And that responsiveness may be how we then think about what's going on. It may be how we imagine. It's the imagination is entering in here as to how we might respond. It's the choice of words and actions that we then engage in. In other words, the fourth of these tasks is to respond to life in such a way that it creates a path, a way of being in the world. That this non-reactive space is an ethical space. It's a space in which we are free and more sensitized to respond more appropriately to the life that's confronting us. And this Buddhism broadly calls the Eightfold Path. But we'll come back to that as we continue. It's important, I think, to acknowledge that this Dharma practice is not just becoming good at a set of techniques, of meditative techniques. It's not about developing a very deep knowledge of Buddhist philosophy or psychology. It's an ethical path that is a lifelong project. I don't find it so helpful to have some goal like enlightenment and to think that one's life is always about working in such a way that one day you will find enlightenment or some other form of mystical attainment. The practice, the goal of the practice is to live as fully, as wisely, as compassionately as you can in each moment, in the moment we're experiencing together now. For me, this is a challenge to speak, to communicate what I feel to be of value, but in a way that seeks to address my audience, you. And in your case, it's a question of how am I listening? How am I paying attention? Critically, perhaps, not blindly, but at the same time, maybe having a degree of interest and curiosity to follow the argument that I will be presenting. And in the practice of the Dharma, the effects of the practice only become apparent over time. It's not a quick fix solution to life's problems. And again, the practice of mindfulness, 8-week course, and then you've solved your problems. I realize that's not how it is presented, but one can sometimes get that idea that here's a technique that's going to solve your suffering. That might work to some degree. But if we take this practice as a practice not so much of solving, emotional problems, let's say, but as a practice that seeks to come to terms with what it means to be human, what it means to live a flourishing life, then we're committed in the long term. And therefore, the practice of the Dharma becomes indistinguishable, really, from the practice of being fully human. But because this is a practice that engages you in your, in your own subjectivity, it's not easy for you to really judge how effective it is. In fact, the effect of your practice might be more evident to your partner or your children or your colleagues at work. They can see the changes, for good or for bad, perhaps better than you. So in letting go of reactivity, you need faith in a process that might not give you immediate or permanent results. If greed and hatred and fear are built into the limbic system of the brain, then they're likely to keep on flaring up, no matter how many years you've devoted to mindfulness, to wisdom, to the jhanas, to bodhicitta, to all of these wonderful things. You know, after years and years of doing this stuff, you still find that you get really irritated and angry and you say cruel things and you get frustrated and restless and so on. So the practice of the Dharma is in a sense a very fragile thing. It's constantly threatened with breakdown. It's constantly threatened with new eruptions of reactivity. And as you get older, which is certainly my experience at the moment, I'm nearly 68 now, you start realizing that your body and your mind begin to break down too. You don't remember things so well. You can't think so clearly. You get obsessed with certain emotional worries and so on more than you used to. And I think this is just because you're getting old. I think as you break down, a lot of things which you were quite good at when you were 30 or 40 don't become so easy anymore. And Dharma practice or meditation is no exception. And this, I think, if we are to keep faith with the Dharma, this kind of faith requires patience, tolerance, humility, and a sense of humor, to be able to smile, to be able to look ironically at your own foolishness. Very important, very important. So we get a sense there of a practice, a commitment to what we might call Dharma or Buddhism. And we keep faith with this practice. We keep at it. And I suspect many of you have been doing this for some time. And that's, in a sense, evidence of faith in what you're doing. It's not judged by its success rate. It's judged by the fact that you feel an affinity, you value what its philosophy tells you, it speaks to your ethical sensibilities, and you commit yourself to it, to try to live that way. Let me give you a couple of examples of faith that we find in the early Buddhist texts. Both of these examples are taken from a scripture called the Milinda Panha, the questions of King Milinda. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. It's a text that probably was composed maybe 200 or 300 years after Gautama, the Buddha, lived. And it records a dialogue between a Buddhist monk called Nagasena and an Indo-Greek king who in Greek is called Menander. I don't want to get too much into the background of this, but after the invasions of Alexander at the end of the 4th century BC, there were established in India, what is largely now Pakistan, Greek communities run by Greek kings and practicing Greek culture and so on and so forth. So there was Greek communities in India. And many of these Greek communities became very interested in Buddhism. And finally, when the Greeks lost their power in Europe and Rome became the great empire, then many of these Greeks became Buddhists. They couldn't become Hindus. They'd lost touch with their homeland, and they converted to Buddhism. And it's probably slightly before that period that this dialogue takes place. And Mananda, the king, asks the monk, Nagasena, how would you define faith? And this is the answer. Faith, says Nagasena, has two characteristics: clarification and leaping, like jumping. Clarifying and jumping. And he gives a picture of a mighty king who crosses a river with an army of elephants and horses and soldiers, and then instructs the army to pause and drink some water. And as they stand around in the river and they drink the water becomes very muddy. It becomes very, very brown and messy and so on. And the king then says that, in order to drink this, you need a special gem, a special jewel, a magical jewel that would cause the mud to separate from the water so that the water becomes clear and settled. It's a strange image, but it doesn't really matter. Nagasena compares faith to this magical gem that clarifies dirty water. It's like a water purifying tablet in which the mud and the dirt sink to the bottom and the water becomes clear again. And similarly, faith clarifies the mind of its defilements, its reactivity, and makes it clear, pure, and serene. Now, this image may not fit very well with our Western ideas of faith. Here, faith is understood as a kind of inner clarity of mind. It's an intuitive conviction that is based upon your own capacity to see the non-reactive quality of your awareness. So your faith in the practice is founded not in what you believe, it's not founded in what you hope for, it's founded in your own glimpse, your own insight, experientially, into the lucid qualities of your own mind. And in other words, faith is already within you. Your faith in something has to do with experience that you've already had. Now, you get the same idea in the Pali discourses, in the suttas, when the Buddha speaks about stream entry, which is the moment where you enter the stream of the Eightfold Path. And this is described as having achieving what's called in Pali pasada. Now, pasada also means clearness, clarity, brightness, and purity. But it's understood as a kind of lucid confidence in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So in other words, this is also a kind of faith. It's a different word, but it's usually translated as faith. And it has to do with your conviction or your confidence, which is a lucidity, a clarity of mind in the Buddha, meaning not the historical Buddha, but the state of being awake. It is your confidence in the practice and the teachings of the Dharma. And it's your confidence in those with whom you practice this path, the Sangha. So this is what stream entry is traditionally defined as confidence and lucidity, lucid confidence, let's say, in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And Buddha, Dharma, Sangha here refers to your primary values of what matters most to you in your life. You have confidence that you can be more awake. You are confident that there is a practice and a philosophy that can help you become more awake. And you have confidence in the friendships, in the communities that support this process. So that's one image of faith, this idea of inner clarity that is also a clarity about your primary values in Buddhism, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. But that's only one of Nagasena's images. He says faith is twofold, clarifying and leaping. So let's go to leaping. As for leaping, he says, imagine a crowd of people arriving on the bank of a river swollen by a violent storm, who are afraid of the width and the depth of the river and hesitate to cross it. But then a man appears who, knowing his own capacity and power, takes a great leap which brings him safely to the other bank of the river. And having seen this, then the other people who are frightened will also find the courage to leap across the river themselves. Similarly, Nagasena continues, when you recognize that the minds of other people are freed and liberated, you too find the faith to leap towards such a state yourself. So this is a different picture, although both, interestingly, are about rivers, drinking rivers, purifying rivers, crossing rivers. And river, I think, really is a metaphor for the flow of life itself, really, and how we deal with life's challenges. So someone you meet in your life who inspires you is a great source of your own faith in what is humanly possible. And so this is acknowledging the value of teachers, especially in a Buddhist setting, inspiring figures. And I'm sure each of us can think of someone or several people who have appeared in your life, maybe briefly, but have had an impact on you that has given you confidence in your own capacity. And there's many figures in our Buddhist world today, someone like the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh or Chogyam Trungpa, whoever it might be, or maybe someone who's not famous, someone who's just a mindfulness teacher, or someone who's not even a Buddhist, someone who just exhibits the sorts of values that you admire. It may be a parent, it might be a friend, it might be a colleague, or it might just be somebody you met when you were flying in a plane, sitting next to you. It's remarkable how, we all have people, encounters in our lives that somehow inspire us that we too could also live differently. We don't have to feel, constrained by our sense of inability or our hesitation. I couldn't do that. When you see somebody else do it, that gives you the courage and the confidence and the faith in your own capacities. Now, today in Europe, when we think of faith as a kind of leaping, we think of Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who lived in the late 19th century. And Kierkegaard, very famously, spoke of the leap of faith, the leap of faith. Although weirdly, he never actually used those words. But he spoke in such a way that quite, legitimately can be summarized in this idea of the leap of faith. And what Kierkegaard means by this is that faith cannot simply be about what you believe in your mind or in your intellect. It's not arriving at some cognitive certainty that, yes, the Bible is true or the Buddhist teachings are true. It's not that kind of faith. That's just an intellectual conviction. It might be helpful, but it could also be just a very strong opinion, which you hold for all kinds of reasons. But it's not, for Kierkegaard, what faith is really about. For Kierkegaard, faith is rooted in passion. It's rooted in your deepest cares and concerns. And when you entrust yourself to a spiritual life, and for him, of course, it's Christianity, that this requires making a decision to lead your life in a certain way that is not reducible to some rational argument. I believe in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha because, and you give a whole list of reasons. I'm a Buddhist because. If you engage with a practice that includes the whole of your existence, that every part of you, not just your head, but your heart and your body and your sense of being a social being in a society with others, then faith becomes a movement of your whole being. And I think this is also captured very well in Nagasena's example of a strong person who comes to the river and jumps across. The whole person is involved. And that, I feel, is a very important point. And I think that's closer, perhaps, to what we would understand by faith in our own culture. But now we have to move on to imagination. Again, I think imagination is part of this leap of faith. Our capacity to imagine living in the world in a different way and being able to take the risk of making that jump, making that leap. So I'd like to consider imagination not as a something that exists separately from the rest of the path, as some special quality that you might have, but actually as an integral part of the Eightfold Path, an integral part of the middle way that is so, so central to what Dharma practice is about. And I think it's important at this point to recognize that the Buddha was not primarily concerned with the nature of reality, with how the world is, with the nature of the self, whether the self exists or doesn't exist. These are issues that Buddhism became very, very interested in and has an awful lot to say about it. But my sense is that Gautama's principal concern was not about how the world is, but how the world could be, how the world ought to be. And to tread the middle way, therefore, is not about arriving at some kind of certainty about the nature of reality, but treading the middle way is a constant balancing act that helps you steer a course through the shifting, unpredictable, and often perilous or dangerous landscape of your world. So the Eightfold Path, the middle way, is about seeking in each moment to live fully according to how you imagine yourself and the world as they could be, rather than how they are now. In that sense, it's a process of transcendence, in the sense that you transcend, or you go beyond what limits you, what constrains you, what holds you back from jumping across the river. My friend, the philosopher Robert Ellis, who recently published a book called The Buddha's Middle Way, he has expanded on this idea of the middle way, I think, in a very helpful fashion. And for him, the middle way needs to be thought of as a principle of judgment. That's urteilen, I think, to judge. It's a principle of judgment. It's a principle of ethical decision-making. And it's concerned with how we respond to our experience, rather than making a claim about the way things finally are. The middle way avoids all absolutes. In other words, the things are like this or they are not like this. And as such, it embodies an ethics of uncertainty and risk. The middle way is a path, but it's not a path that is somehow static, just like a road or an autobahn. The middle way is a metaphor for the course or the path that we are called upon to create and to sustain and to develop as our life unfolds from day to day. And as an ethical being, as someone who imagines a world that is different to the one that we actually live in and seeks to create that world, I keep finding myself in situations where I'm called upon to respond. I mean, this is life. You wake up in the morning, you don't know what you're going to be called upon to do in the rest of the day. I mean, in lockdown, like with, every day is kind of predictable, but we are constantly being surprised. Unexpected things keep happening, right? We get an email telling us something that we really didn't want to know about, but we have to respond to it. We're constantly being challenged by life itself to practice the Dharma, rather than to just, keep repeating the same patterns of behavior that we're used to. We're called upon to say something and to do something that might be difficult, for which there is no obvious right answer. And particularly if you have a more secular approach to the Dharma, you may not have the kind of religious beliefs that many Buddhists would otherwise have. Law of karma, the 5 precepts, all of these kind of things. That you don't have the security of those certainties. Instead, you're called upon in your own limited way to respond appropriately to what is challenging you in your life from moment to moment. Now, the middle way is not a teaching that is exclusive to Buddhism. In fact, it's a guiding principle that you find in many different cultures and religions. In Greek philosophy, it's called the golden mean, with Aristotle, for example. So it's not an exclusively Buddhist idea at all. In fact, it's almost like ethical common sense in some ways, leading a balanced life that's not slipping into some kind of extreme or inappropriate behavior on one side or the other. But what I think is unique about the Buddha's understanding of the middle way is that he describes it as an eightfold path. In other words, the middle way operates within every area of our humanity. It's not just about my spiritual or my ethical life. It has to do with the way I see the world, my perspective, my Ansicht, my view of myself and the world. That's usually the first step of the Eightfold Path. And the second step is what I call imagination. This then leads us to speech, how we give voice to our actions. It has to do with how we work. It has to do with how we survive. It has to do with how we channel our energies. It has to do with how we practice mindfulness, concentration. In other words, all areas of human life are included in this practice of the middle way. So the middle way serves as a means of integrating these dimensions of your life in such a way that enable you to flourish as a person. And when practiced in a community with others, then the Eightfold Path becomes the framework for an emerging culture. What you cultivate becomes a culture. And that, I feel, is something we're beginning to witness over the last 30, 40 years of Buddhism in the West. We're beginning to see a Buddhist culture emerging. And I think probably the most visible result of this has been the expansion of mindfulness into healthcare, business, and many other areas of contemporary life. And this, I think, is the beginnings, the first seeds of what I would like to be a culture of awakening, where these values become more and more internalized individually and expressed and embodied in various cultural forms in the world. Might be a bit idealistic, but what I've seen over the last 40 years gives me some hope that these ideas are not just about Buddhism or Buddhists, but they have a universality. They speak to the human condition, and they can be effective in making a positive transformation in people's lives. But imagination is usually not included in the Eightfold Path. Traditionally, at least in English, I can't remember what the German translations would be, but you have right view, right intention, right speech, right action, and so on. I've always been puzzled by the second step, right intention. Sometimes it's translated simply as right thought. So you have perspective, and then you have thought or intention. But the problem with that is that there are two very common words in Pali, in Sanskrit, for intention and for thought. Intention is cetana. Thought is vitarka or vitaka. Yet neither of these words are used in the Eightfold Path. In the Eightfold Path, the second step in Pali is called Sankapa. Sankapa. Not cetana, not vitaka, not intention, not thought, but Sankapa. And Sankapa, S-A-N-K-A-P-P-A, Sankapa, is a term that you don't find elsewhere very often in the Pali discourses. It only really occurs in the Eightfold Path. But then it gets treated and understood just as a synonym for intention. I'm suspicious about that. What does the word Sankapa mean, literally? Sankapa, well, the sun is basically just gives intensification. The word, the kappa is from the verb kapeti. And kapeti means, according to the Pali dictionary, it means to create, to build, to construct, to arrange, to prepare, or to order. There's no mention here of thought or intention. To create, to build, to construct, to arrange, to prepare, to order. It's quite closely connected to another word called vikapa or vikalpa in Sanskrit, which is in fact often translated as to imagine, to imagination. So my sense is that Sankapa is talking more about imagination. In other words, how we picture, how we construct, how we develop an idea of what we can then do. It's not just about the motivation. That might be part of it. But I think it captures more the power of the imagination itself. And this imagination emerges from the perspective or the Ansicht that animates the middle way. And this emerges from a non-reactive space of nirvana, as we've mentioned, this still centered, non-binary awareness, which has let go of the extremes of is and isn't, of right and wrong. It's suspended, at least momentarily, the patterns of attraction and aversion and desire and fear. And it frees you, therefore, to respond to life situations in another way. So imagination is liberated by a perspective on life that has let go of basically dualism, binary thinking, is and isn't. It's a bit like the idea of negative capability that we find in the English poet John Keats. This perspective is a kind of negative capability. It's the absence of certain attachments and fears and opinions where, and this is, I'm quoting this from Keats, where a person is able to rest in uncertainties, mysteries, and doubts without any irritable reaching after fact or reason. For Keats, that's the definition of the creative mind of an artist, and he has in mind particularly Shakespeare. So this Eightfold Path emerges, I feel, from a negative capability, a capability in which attachment, aversion, confusion are temporarily freed. And that is what allows us to imagine. That's what, in a way, feeds the imagination. The problem is that imagination is very often inhibited by received opinions, biases, habits. It's very difficult to think of an alternative to what is already familiar. Imagination allows us to entertain possibilities that you might not have thought of before. And this is as true for the artist, or even the potter, the cook, the person raising children. You have to imagine the kind of painting or pot or dish in the kitchen that you're going to make, and then you engage with the making of that pot or that painting or that meal. But imagination is just as important for an ethical life as it is for an artistic or a creative life. And the reason for this is because imagination is what allows us to be empathetic, to have empathy. I can empathize with someone else's suffering because I can imagine what it is like to be them. And as I wonder about how to respond to their suffering, I imagine what it would be like for that person to hear what I have to say. I cannot consider, or I cannot conceive of an ethical response without the capacity of the imagination. To imagine how the other person feels, to imagine how the other person will respond to what I say or to do. And it's this ethical imagination that helps me weigh the different options as I prepare myself for that decisive moment when I risk saying something or doing something. So to practice ethics is to imagine the kind of life I wish to lead, to imagine the kind of person I seek to be, to imagine the kind of society that I wish to create on this earth. So that's all I want to share this evening. We still have nearly half an hour left. From Paul, confidence and intention seem to be siblings of faith and imagination. Would you agree? Siblings, in other words, brothers or sisters. Confidence and intention seem to be siblings of faith and imagination. Yeah, I can go along with that. Yes, I don't. But again, I think we're getting into semantics a bit here. I spend a lot of time as a translator trying to find the right English word for faith, for sada or pasada. I've given up on that. I think we need to honor the power of the words we already have and to invest them with new meaning. So I actually now speak quite openly about faith. It's in some ways it would be more convenient to say confidence or trust, Vertrauen, I think, in German. But that's not the same thing. That's not the same thing. I mean, it's relatively weak. There's something about some of these words that have a great power to them. They come through our traditions, our spiritual traditions, our philosophical traditions. They have a long history. And the word faith is one of those words. I'm very reluctant to let go of that word. I think we need to reinvest it with deeper meaning. I agree. But I think we need to really struggle with the word itself. In German, I know it's Glauben. And sometimes people say, oh, Glauben, that's belief. Well, I don't think so. It's that's part of it, yes. But anyway, this is this is a semantic issue. But yeah, confidence, intention, very nice. But again, I would suspend. There's a lot. Buddhism says a lot about intention. Intention is a very important part of the path. The Buddha said that karma is cetana, action is intention. He didn't say karma is sankapa. So I don't think I think intention is clearly important, but I don't think it's what the second step of the Eightfold Path means, even though tradition understands it that way. My feeling is that these 8 words that we find in all traditions for the Eightfold Path, we need to take those words seriously. And if they're different from other terms in Buddhism, we have to ask why. Like, for example, the 4th or the 5th step of the path is called samakamanta. And this is always translated as right action. Right? Samakamanta, right action. But that's not what kamanta means. Action is kamma, not kamanta. But nobody seems to comment on that. I find that very strange. What does kamanta mean? It means work. It means employment. It doesn't mean just action in a general sense, let alone just physical action. It means work. And for this reason, I think of it as in those terms now. I want to honor the original term. we could argue as to why it changed, but that's not a topic for this evening. So we don't seem to have much. Marianne says, thank you so much for explaining Kamanta, or Sankapa, I'm sorry. So if there's no more questions, I think a good way to, oh yeah, and I'll do that later. As you might imagine, I'm writing about all of this at the moment. And one of the great benefits of COVID-19 is that it's given me a long, uninterrupted period of time to write, to actively engage my imagination in my work, my Sankapa with my Kamanta. And I've now completed about half of another book, which is called The Ethics of Uncertainty. Oh, we're getting some more questions now. Okay, let me jump to that. This is from Jan Ulm. To use another Wittgenstein quote, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. Yeah, I nearly said that as well. That's kind of what I was getting at. And this is, I think, a very useful part in the philosophy of Wittgenstein. He argues that the meaning of a word is not how you define it in a dictionary. The meaning of a word is how it is used in a living language. And the questioner, Jan, then goes on to say, so do we really know how the words were used in Pali? Good question. We don't. We can only infer by context and by setting and by the various questions the Buddha is asked, is what he might have meant by those terms. But the meaning we gain from them is found in their usage more than in their dictionary definition. So when I get a word like Kamanta, I look it up, and then I find the passages in the discourses, in the sutta, in which it's used. And the passage that really changed my mind on this is a very famous passage. It concerns after the Buddha's talking about his own practice, his own path. And after he's finished, he does all of these deep meditations. That doesn't get him anywhere. He then goes and does all these ascetic practices, starving himself and doing all these things. That doesn't get him anywhere. And then he says, what do I do now? And then he remembers an experience he had as a child where he was sitting beneath a rose apple tree, and he, while his father was at his work, and he fell into a state of meditation, which he subsequently calls the first jhana. Now, the word for work is kamanta. In other words, when my father was at his kamanta, when my father was at his work. And there you can see in the context, in the usage, the word doesn't just mean action. It means quite explicitly doing a job. So that's an example of seeing how the word is used in a context. And that's what opened my eyes to this. And then I look it up in the dictionary, and that's what the dictionary says too. Kamanta means work. That's the first meaning. Second meaning, in the Eightfold Path, it means action. But the original meaning is work. And I think, personally, that one of the reasons that it got changed was because monks don't work. They don't have employment. They don't have businesses. Or at least they're not supposed to. And if the monk is to be the ideal Buddhist practitioner, then how can they do kamanta, business, work, employment? So I think they then interpreted it to mean bodily action in general. Now, of course, lots of questions coming now. This is from Janina. How much reality is in imagination? Reality is where we are in the moment and not imagining something like dreaming. Well, this is a question I am often asked. And it shows the extent to which imagination is given a bad press in Buddhism. Imagination is associated with fantasy. It's associated with, dreaming, just conjuring up things in your mind. That's your imagination. And that, of course, is part of it. Imagination is not necessarily a good thing, but then none of the things in the Eightfold Path are exclusively good things. Speech, livelihood, mindfulness. They can be skillful or unskillful. Imagination too. It can be unskillful if it means that when you meditate, all you do is fantasize. Yeah, imagination is full on. But what would skillful imagination then be? That's the question I think we have to explore. And that's what I'm interested in here. Imagination as part of the creative process, not just of the artist, but of anybody who seeks to resolve a certain question or problem by imagining another solution. Or a scientist. Some of the great breakthroughs in science are basically achieved by the imagination. Einstein, famously, suddenly he got it. Suddenly, the image occurred in his mind as to how to proceed. I think we need to restore the imagination as an integral part of our practice, but to be fully aware that it can go off. It can also be chaotic and fantastical as well. So it's about training the imagination, both creatively and ethically, to be an integral part of the path. And in my own case, as a writer and as an artist, the imagination is a very, very central part of what my life is about. Each thing I write is I'm basically imagining the Dharma in a way that I hope will speak to the kinds of situations we find in the world today. That requires imagination. Some people will say, well, that's just your fantasy. That's just your own confused thinking. But I know when I'm really feeling fully alive, that very often is because my imagination is fully engaged. And I'm not just repeating what's been done in the past, but I'm imagining new ways of being human. This is from Magda. Imagination and creativity are words with which we are very familiar, but these words are not closely related to ethics. For example, we see many artists with wonderful artwork, but as human beings, well, let's say they aren't the most ethical. So in your opinion, is ethics fundamental to imagination? In my opinion, ethics is fundamental to imagination if it is to become part of the Eightfold Path. Yes. But imagination just by itself doesn't have any intrinsic ethical value. And again, I think it's a very good example. You get someone like, I won't name any names, but there's plenty of artists who are incredible imaginations, but are actually, not the most inspiring examples of human beings. In other words, they're very good at that particular aspect of their life, but it's not integrated into a sort of life that we would necessarily admire. But what the Dharma practice is about, as I would understand it, is about integrating all of the elements of our humanity in a life in which we're able to flourish both as an individual, in other words, to realize the fullness of our potential, but also within a society. to be aware of the impact of our actions on others, to be aware of our capacity to inspire and to live a life of compassion and love. Imagination has to be framed within that context, rather than just, this artist is a brilliant imagination, but the rest of his life is a mess. That's, to me, not admirable. But I would still admire and value the works of art. I mean, a good example is Caravaggio. Michelangelo di Mersi di Caravaggio. Caravaggio's art, early 17th century in Rome, is incredible, I find. I find it deeply moving, deeply religious. But I wouldn't want to get too close to Caravaggio. He murdered people. He was a pretty nasty piece of work. And so clearly his religious and his artistic imagination was extraordinary, but his life not, frankly. But yeah, that's an important question. Okay, where are we? This is from Nyam, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. What's the major difference between dreams and so-called reality from a Buddhist standpoint? Well, the main difference is that dreams are purely subjective. And reality is something we share with others. And this is an important point, because we have to remember that the Buddha spoke of being awake, awakening. And in other words, the metaphor he uses for, his experience is that of being awake, of waking up. And what do you wake up from? You wake up from a dream, or you wake up from a deep sleep. Again, metaphorically. So dreams are what you have maybe every night, in which there's a reality going on for you in your dream, but you are the only person experiencing it. It's not something you share with anybody else, even the other figures in your dream. You have a dream about your mother, but your mother is not aware of your dream. She's not there. It's all going on in your own internal processes in your brain. When you wake up from a dream, then you find yourself in what we call reality. And one of the features of reality that's absolutely central is that we share that reality. We find ourselves in relation to the world, which is also witnessed, seen, heard, smelt, tasted, touched by other people, by other forms of life. We encounter other people, animals, birds. These are not just figments of my imagination. These are beings that have their own independence and autonomy, and they can impact my life in unpredictable ways, and I am then, as it were, called upon to respond to them. So I think there is a very, very important difference between dreams and so-called reality. You don't need the so-called dreams and reality. Unfortunately, there are Buddhist and Hindu teachings that say the world is like a dream. And we tend sometimes to take that too literally, to think that the world is just an illusion. The Buddha never said the world is an illusion. He said on occasion, he said, it is like an illusion. It's like a dream. There are elements that of similarity you could compare, but they're quite different things. Okay, we're running out of time. This is from Joshua Denning. Regarding the difficulty of translation and the gradual process of adding or deepening meanings of already used words, what's your take on refraining to translate key terms? For example, it seems to be relatively popular not to translate dukkha in order to avoid having readers focus on only their really nasty suffering. Yeah, this is something, again, I think about a lot. And I have moved my position on this. For a long time, I was part of this group of people who said, you can't translate dukkha. It covers too much. We have to try and get dukkha to become part of the English language, like in the same way that we don't translate nirvana or samsara. Dukkha, same thing. I don't agree with that anymore. I think it's Buddhist jargon. And I think suffering is a perfectly good word for this. And I think we need to enrich and deepen our sense of suffering. Suffering is a very powerful word, like faith. And I think to dispense with that, I think there are problems, I agree. It makes people think only of the painful things. But I think it's a word which has tremendous power. And I remember once, many years ago, I was asked to give a talk in New Delhi, in India, and to an audience of Indians, intellectuals, academic types. And I was in the phase there of avoiding, I was saying, I was using words like unsatisfactoriness, trying to avoid having to use the word suffering. And at the end of the talk, somebody said, but you're talking about dukkha, aren't you? And in modern Hindi, dukh, same word as dukkha, means pain. And they couldn't understand why I was going around and round to avoiding saying pain, suffering. That struck them as very strange. They use the word dukkha in their everyday speech in Hindi. Why make a big deal out of it? To be honest, I think the important thing with translation is not to find the right English word for it or the right German word, but actually it's to find a way of speaking, an idiom, a natural way of talking in which the meanings of these terms come through most effectively. So I don't think it's always a good idea just to, if you see the word dukkha, you say suffering. It'll work in many cases, but other cases it won't. We need to be flexible. We need to be imaginative in finding a language, an everyday language, without Buddhist terms like dukkha, but at the same time honoring, our own linguistic and cultural heritage. We have to stop here. Wolfgang Wulmer very kindly suggested that he's looking forward to the 2-semester course at Bodhi College starting in February. Well, funnily enough, I was going to mention that. And it's a program. Hang on, I'm going to put it in the chat now. Where are we, everyone? I'm going to type in, I'm going to give you that's the link to the Bodhi College webpage that gives details of the course After Buddhism and Beyond, is what I'm calling it. And I'm going to be offering this starting on the 13th of February through till the 26th of June. It'll be one session of 3 hours every Saturday at about 3 to 6 European time. And there'll be 2 semesters. So we'll have about 6 weeks, 6 Saturdays in a row. Then we'll have a month off. Then we'll have another 6 Saturdays in a row. And I'll be drawing on material from my book, After Buddhism, in the first seminar. And in the second semester, I'll be exploring what I'm currently writing on uncertainty. So thank you very much. Maybe I'll see some of you on that course. I wish you well, and please keep safe. Please make sure that you don't contract this virus or be a means whereby it's transmitted to anybody else. I have a number of friends who have had COVID. I know 2 people who have died. And I think it's an opportunity for us to really, focus on, our inner life, to respect our solitude and that of others, and to try to make the most out of this, I know, very challenging and sometimes very frustrating and very wearying experience of being in confinement like this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much also from our side, the Buddhist Academy, and I think in the name of everybody else here in the audience. Thank you, Stephen, and you keep well too.
Thank you. Okay, I'll do my best. Okay, I need to go. Keep well. Bye.